In March 2003, the CIA had satellites covering every square meter of eastern Afghanistan, drones flying 24 hours a day, a budget of $40 billion, and yet there was one man they simply couldn't find. There is a military force that operates with a third of the equipment of the world's biggest powers and consistently produces results that billions of dollars in technology cannot replicate. Not because they are larger, not because they have superior weapons, but for a reason that one of the CIA's most experienced analysts took years to finally put into words. The man who witnessed what happened in those mountains had spent 23 years working with the best special units on the planet. He was not someone who impressed easily. He was not someone who chose his words carelessly. That's why, when he sat down in a classified room in Langley and said those British soldiers were a completely different species, no one in the room made a single comment. What exactly did he see? How did a unit created out of a catastrophic failure in the desert during World War II become the model that every special force in the world tries to copy? And why does the most lethal skill of this unit have no price, literally? This video will answer all of that. And if you enjoy military history explained in depth, leave a like now. It really helps the channel bring this kind of content to more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, check whether the notification bell is turned on, because new videos appear without warning for those who don't have it enabled. Now, to understand what happened in those mountains, we need to go back to where it all began. The problem no dollar can solve. Marcus Dunlap didn't believe in stories. He believed in data. In thermal imaging satellites, in signals intelligence, in predator drones flying continuous orbits over Afghanistan. Above all, he believed in the principle that had guided 17 years of his career in the CIA's Special Activities Division. If you can see it, you can hit it. And if you can hit it, you can destroy it. It was 2003. The U.S.-led coalition had overthrown the Taliban regime 16 months earlier, but the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan's tribal areas had turned into an escape corridor for leaders of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The terrain was among the most hostile on the planet. The Spingar mountain range, known to Westerners as the White Mountains, rose to 4,700 meters. In winter, temperatures plunged to -25 degrees. The valleys were narrow, the ridgelines exposed. It was the same territory where Alexander the Great had lost men in 330 BC. The same place where the Soviet Union had poured in 115,000 troops and lost nearly 15,000 dead over 10 years. And it was precisely there that the American approach decided to bet everything it had. Predator and Global Hawk drones flew continuous orbits. Signals intelligence stations monitored every electronic emission. Teams from Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and CIA paramilitary units carried out rapid raids based on intelligence packages that could cost millions of dollars to assemble. The logic was simple. Get in fast, hit hard, extract before the enemy can react. The problem was that it worked only against the careless. Senior al-Qaeda leaders, logistics coordinators, network facilitators, the true architects of operations, had vanished. They moved on foot. They communicated through couriers. They changed locations every 48 to 72 hours. They were invisible to satellites, invisible to drones, invisible to signals intelligence. And they kept killing. A steady stream of improvised explosive devices, ambushes, and coordinated attacks made it clear that the enemy's command structure was still functioning, despite everything the most expensive military in human history could bring to bear. That was when the British appeared, and that was the moment Marcus Dunlap began questioning everything he believed. But to understand why what he witnessed was so unsettling, you first have to understand where that unit came from. The SAS was not born from meticulous planning. It was born from catastrophic failure and from an officer who refused to accept what everyone else had already accepted. In 1941, the war in North Africa had become a brutal war of attrition. The British Eighth Army was being battered by Rommel's Afrika Korps, and conventional strategies were proving costly and ineffective. A young officer from the Scots Guards named David Stirling, recovering from a parachuting accident, had a radical idea. What if small teams of 4 or 5 highly trained men could be infiltrated hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines? No direct confrontation, just surgical sabotage, airfields, supply depots, command posts, followed by immediate withdrawal before the enemy could react. The key wasn't brute force, it was surprise, speed, and precision. Stirling went so far as to physically walk into the Middle East headquarters in Cairo on crutches after his accident to personally present the plan to high command. The unit he created was deliberately given a misleading name, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The goal was to make enemy intelligence believe that a much larger airborne brigade existed. The first mission was a complete disaster. A parachute insertion during a desert storm resulted in the loss of 2/3 of the force without a single enemy aircraft destroyed. It nearly ended the entire experiment. But from that failure came the adaptation that would define the SAS. Stirling abandoned parachute insertions in the desert and partnered with the Long-Range Desert Group, which essentially became their clandestine taxi service. Using modified jeeps armed with Vickers K machine guns, the SAS began traveling hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines, conducting lightning raids and escaping through the unforgiving terrain. In just over a year, Stirling's Ghost Private Army had destroyed more than 250 aircraft on the ground, along with dozens of supply depots, railways, and telecommunications systems, putting hundreds of enemy vehicles out of action. They proved that a handful of highly trained, audacious men could create a strategic impact completely disproportionate to their numbers. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery summed up Stirling in his own way. "The boy Stirling is quite mad, quite mad. However, in a war, there is often a place for mad people." 80 years later, that philosophy, that calculated madness, would arrive in Bagram in battered Land Rovers and older generation radios, and Marcus Dunlap would be the first to write them off as under-equipped. He would also be the first to admit he was spectacularly wrong.
12 Days in the Mountains. The mission had a code name, Operation Dovetail. The objective was to identify and dismantle a high-value network that American intelligence had been tracking for more than 8 months without achieving a single actionable result. 8 months. With the most sophisticated surveillance architecture in human history focused on that region, and nothing. The target was known only by the codename The Pharmacist, an al-Qaeda logistics coordinator responsible for moving weapons, explosives, and personnel through a network of mountain trails that the Americans had failed to map despite continuous satellite surveillance. The pharmacist never used electronic communications. He never stayed in the same place for more than 36 hours. He operated using a system of pre-positioned dead drops and human couriers that was essentially invisible to technological surveillance. He had methodically and deliberately designed his entire existence to be invisible to the American way of making war. The SAS proposed something completely different from anything that had been attempted. No immediate drone support, no vehicles, no helicopter insertion. 2 4-man patrol teams would be infiltrated simultaneously into positions overlooking the most likely transit routes based on human intelligence the squadron had cultivated for weeks through methods Dunlap described as patient beyond anything I'd seen. The patrols would map the network through direct observation, identify the movement pattern of the pharmacist, and provide target data for a capture operation. They would go in on foot, they would leave on foot, and in between they would do what they knew how to do better than any other human beings on the planet: wait. Dunlap asked to accompany one of the patrols. His CIA superior refused. The SAS squadron commander also refused, for completely different reasons. "He told me I wasn't fit enough," Dunlap recalled years later, without any resentment in his voice. He was right. Dunlap trained with the squadron's men for 3 consecutive weeks. By the end, he could barely keep up with their pace. It wasn't a question of willpower. It was something he was only beginning to understand. Those men were not just well-trained. They were the product of decades of selection and institutional culture that produced a very specific kind of human being, a type he, with all his experience, had never encountered before. On the night of April 14th, the patrols departed. The approach march covered 22 kilometers through mountainous terrain at altitudes above 3,800 meters, where the oxygen content of the air is roughly 62% of sea level. Each man carried between 68 and 73 kilograms. Water alone weighed 18 kilograms per man, 12 liters distributed in pouches throughout the pack to prevent the sound of liquid sloshing. Food rations were calculated at 1,800 calories per day instead of the recommended 3,500 because reducing food weight allowed them to carry more water and ammunition. They would lose weight during the mission. They knew it. They accepted it. The insertion took 9 hours. 9 hours, climbing in total darkness over uneven terrain at altitude with 70 kilograms on their backs, no trails, navigating by map, compass, and stars because the GPS units were deliberately turned off to avoid any possibility of electronic detection by the enemy's counter-surveillance systems. The point man navigated entirely by terrain features he had memorized from satellite imagery studied for 48 hours before departure. Throughout the entire journey, he made a single navigation error of approximately 300 meters, which he corrected in less than 20 minutes after identifying a specific rock formation he had committed to memory. The patrols reached their observation positions before dawn, and then they did what Dunlap later described in his debrief as almost incomprehensible. They stopped moving completely. 4 days, then 4 more, then more. Motionless in a shallow scrape dug into the mountainside covered with camouflage netting and loose stones, overlooking a valley that satellite imagery had identified as a probable transit route but had never confirmed through ground-level observation. They urinated in bottles, they defecated in bags, they ate cold rations because heating anything would produce a detectable thermal signature. They slept in 2-hour rotations, one man always on optics, recording every movement in the valley below in a notebook that, by the end of the mission, would contain 47 pages of handwritten observations. On day 6, the temperature at the patrol position dropped to minus 19 degrees Celsius. They could not like heating tablets. They could not move to generate heat. They lay in their hides inside sleeping bags rated for minus 10 degrees Celsius, shivering the entire night in absolute silence, without making a single movement that could compromise their position. One operator's water froze inside its pouch. He fought it by holding it against his body for 3 hours. On day 8, the position of one patrol was approached by a goat herder. He came within 7 meters of the hide. 7 meters, less than the width of a living room. The 4 men remained completely motionless, controlling their breathing for 47 minutes while the herder's goats wandered around their positions. At one point, one of the goats stepped directly on the camouflage net covering the patrol commander's legs. He did not move. He did not make a single sound. Eventually, the shepherd left without detecting anything. 4 men, 7 meters from a civilian, 47 minutes, no movement. While all this was happening in the mountains, American operators in the operations center at Bagram openly questioned the logic of the mission. Predator drone pilots accustomed to real-time action and constant visual confirmation found the idea of remaining motionless for 72 hours waiting for something to happen fundamentally alien to their operational culture. One pilot told Dunlap directly, "If we haven't seen anything in 3 days, there's nothing to see." Dunlap relayed the comment to the SAS commander. The commander's response was exactly 4 words: "They haven't looked properly." On the 4th day, at 3:15 a.m., Patrol Alpha observed 3 men crossing the valley on foot. They carried no visible weapons. They moved with speed and purpose. The SAS observer noted their route, their pace, and the fact that the 3 men stopped at a specific rock for approximately 90 seconds before continuing. At dawn, the patrol's second observer used a telescopic lens to examine the rock. Carved into its surface was a mark that had not been present in satellite images taken 8 days earlier. A dead drop marker. Invisible to any satellite, invisible to any drone, visible only to a pair of human eyes that had spent 4 days patiently learning to distinguish what belonged in that valley from what did not. Over the next 8 days, the 2 patrols mapped what Dunlap later described as the most sophisticated human courier network I encountered in my entire career. They observed 47 separate movements through the valley, all conducted between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. They identified 14 individuals through physical description, gait analysis, and distinctive characteristics, a method requiring exactly the kind of detailed, patient, cumulative observation that no drone or satellite could replicate. They located 7 dead drop sites. They identified 3 compounds serving as relay stations along the routes. They mapped the timing patterns and determined that the network operated on a 7-day rotational cycle, with specific routes used on specific nights. It was an entire architecture of clandestine movement, sophisticated, disciplined, operating for months under the nose of American intelligence that had been completely invisible until the moment 8 men decided to lie on the ground and simply look. On the 9th day, they identified the pharmacist. He arrived on foot at 3:42 a.m., accompanied by 2 men. The observer from Patrol Bravo recognized him, not from his face, it was too dark for facial identification, but from his gait. CIA intelligence reports had described the pharmacist as walking with a pronounced limp in his left leg, the result of a shrapnel wound during the Soviet-Afghan War. Through a night vision scope, the observer watched the limping man cross the valley, stop at a dead drop site for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, and then continue to a compound that had been monitored for 6 consecutive days. The patrol transmitted a 9-second burst. It contained the pharmacist's location, the compound's exact coordinates, the number of personnel present, observed weapons, and a recommended assault timeline. 18 hours later, a joint Anglo-American force, 12 SAS and 24 from Delta, assaulted the compound. The pharmacist was captured alive. On him were documents identifying 11 additional nodes of the network across 3 different provinces.
Dunlap stood in the operations center for a long moment after receiving confirmation. He wrote a note in his report. Then he stared at it, unable to write anything else. "We spent $1 million on a signals intelligence platform covering that valley," he said later, choosing each word carefully. 4 British soldiers with binoculars and a notebook produced better intelligence in 4 days than that platform produced in 4 months. I found that genuinely difficult to process. Difficult to process. For a man who had built an entire career on the premise that technology was the ultimate force multiplier, what had happened in those mountains was not merely a successful operation. It was an empirical refutation of something he had believed in for 17 years. And the question he could not stop asking was simple and unsettling. How was it even possible that this had happened? What no budget can buy. 3 years after the events in Afghanistan, Marcus Dunlap sat in a debriefing room in Langley and said with absolute conviction that the Special Air Service was a completely different species. The room fell silent. Not because the statement was dramatic. Dunlap did not do dramatic, he did precise. He was a man who had spent 23 years producing classified assessments about the capabilities of Allied and enemy special forces. He had coordinated operations with Delta Force. He had worked with SEAL Team 6. He had been present in some of the most dangerous operational environments on the planet. And in all those years, he had never used that word to describe anything. Different. Not better in some aspects, not superior under certain conditions. Different, as if the SAS occupied a category that his existing analytical framework simply could not accommodate. When questioned about the expression during the debrief, Dunlap was deliberate. When I say they're a different species, I don't mean they're superhuman. I mean they've evolved for a different environment. The distinction mattered. The American special operator had been built and optimized for a specific function, the fast precision strike, the 45-minute direct action raid, the night assault based on real-time intelligence, the ability to enter any point on the planet with total technological superiority and leave before the enemy could react. No one in the world executes that better than Delta Force or SEAL Team 6. No one. Dunlap stated this without hesitation and without empty diplomacy. He genuinely believed it. But there was a category of problem, narrow and critical, where this approach did not merely fail, it actively got in the way. Where the enemy had designed its operations specifically to be invisible to everything American technology could offer. And in that category, the SAS operator did not compete with the American one. He operated on a completely different plane. The SAS operator had been optimized for the long game, the 14-day patrol behind enemy lines with no external support, the 6-month covert operation on the streets of Belfast, where you are not a soldier, you are a shadow, the 3-year advisory mission in Oman, where you learn the language, live with the locals, understand the culture from the inside out, fight their war their way, and build a military force from the ground up. This ability to fully adapt to the environment, human, cultural, physical, was something Dunlap had observed closely for months and still found impossible to quantify in any report. But where did that ability come from? How had it been built, and why couldn't it simply be replicated with proper training and funding? To answer that, it is necessary to understand that the SAS did not arrive in Afghanistan in 2003 as a finished product. It arrived as the accumulated result of 8 decades of continuous evolution, each conflict adding a layer, each failure generating an adaptation, each generation passing down something that was not written in any manual. After its legendary operations in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe during World War II, the SAS was dissolved in 1945. The conventional military mindset of the post-war period simply saw no place for irregular units in a peacetime army. It was a mistake that almost proved costly. Because the world had not finished producing irregular wars, it had only just begun. The collapse of the British Empire and the conflicts of the Cold War soon provided a new battlefield, and this time the enemy would not be sitting on a desert airfield. He would be hidden inside the civilian population, inside the jungle, inside the social fabric of local communities. It was during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s that the SAS re-emerged and discovered its second calling. Here, the unit was not fighting a conventional army, but a communist insurgency dissolved into the civilian population and the nearly impenetrable jungle. Desert tactics were completely useless. The regiment had to reinvent itself from scratch.
Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Mike Calvert, the SAS learned to operate in the jungle for months at a time, living off the land, building relationships with indigenous tribes, and developing a deep understanding of what would later be called the human terrain. It was here that the philosophy of hearts and minds was born, the understanding that a war against insurgency would not be won by the number of enemies killed, but by the ability to separate the insurgent from the population that sustained and protected him. It was an approach that required patience, cultural intelligence, and a willingness to think in timelines measured in years, not weeks. In subsequent conflicts, Borneo, Aden, Oman, the SAS continued to accumulate layers. In Aden, in the violent and claustrophobic alleys of the city, they developed and refined the close-quarters combat techniques that would later define the global standard for counterterrorism operations. These were the so-called kini-mini operations, a Swahili term referring to the sinuous sliding movement of a snake, in which small teams conducted covert surveillance and capture operations against urban terrorists. Every conflict was a school, every school produced doctrine, and every doctrine was absorbed into the institutional DNA of the regiment. Then came the moment that placed the SAS in front of the entire world. On May 5, 1980, 6 terrorists were holding 26 hostages inside the Iranian embassy at Prince's Gate in London. After 5 days of stalemate, one hostage was executed and his body thrown into the street. The British government gave the order. In an event broadcast live to the entire world, black-clad figures appeared on the balconies of the building, windows exploded, and in exactly 17 minutes, the SAS stormed the building, eliminated 5 of the 6 terrorists, and rescued almost all the hostages alive. Operation Nimrod was such a precise, surgical, and absolutely controlled demonstration of applied violence that it instantly became the global reference standard for hostage rescue operations. The image of the SAS operator, black clothing, mask, MP5 submachine gun was etched into global consciousness. And when Colonel Charlie Beckwith was tasked with creating the U.S. Army's Elite Special Operations Unit, Delta Force, he explicitly modeled it after the SAS, where he had served as an exchange officer. What Dunlap had discovered in Afghanistan, however, went beyond any spectacular operation. Something more fundamental was at play.
He had identified the central philosophical difference between the two approaches. The American system was built on the assumption that technology would work. The British system was built on the assumption that it would not. And that difference was not accidental. It was the direct result of decades operating with a defense budget that was only a fraction of the American one, which forced the SAS to develop capabilities that did not depend on equipment because there simply was no money for the equipment. Necessity had created the doctrine, and the doctrine had created the kind of soldier Dunlap had observed for 12 days in the mountains. Dunlap's classified assessment included a formal recommendation that the CIA's Special Activities Division develop a sustained covert observation capability modeled on SAS methods. The recommendation was partially implemented. A small number of CIA paramilitary officers underwent modified training at the SAS facility in Herefordshire, focused on extended observation techniques and low-technology operations. The program worked for approximately 3 years before being shut down due to budget constraints and shifting strategic priorities. Dunlap expressed no surprise when he heard the program had been canceled. The reason, to him, was obvious, and it was exactly the point he had been trying to articulate from the beginning. You can teach the techniques, he said. You can teach a man to lie still for 4 days. You can teach him to navigate by stars. You can teach him to observe and record and analyze. What you can't teach, what you can't buy, is the culture. The SAS has been doing this since David Sterling founded the regiment in North Africa in 1941.
That is over 60 years of institutional knowledge, of regimental tradition, of a selection process that identifies the specific type of human being who can endure what these operations demand. You cannot replicate that with a 3-year training program. You cannot replicate it at all. You can only observe it and learn what you can from the margins. That was the answer. Not technology, not budget, not even training in the conventional sense of the word. It was culture, accumulated, transmitted, and refined across generations inside an institution that had learned, conflict after conflict, that the most reliable force multiplier was not a machine. It was a human being who had been selected, tested, and hardened to a point where he could function when everything else had failed. When Dunlap retired from the CIA in 2009, he began teaching a seminar at Georgetown University on Allied Special Operations Cooperation. The course became one of the most competitive in the security studies program. Students who attended reported that he dedicated an entire 2-hour session exclusively to Operation Dovetail, the 12 days in the mountains, and that he told the story with such precision and intensity that the room seemed to disappear around them. Years later, a journalist researching a book on special operations asked Dunlap whether his assessment of the SAS had changed over time. Dunlap thought for a long moment, long enough that the journalist believed he might not answer. Then he said, "When we got the pharmacist, when the assault went in and we rolled up the entire network, I went to their squadron commander afterward. I wanted to congratulate him, to acknowledge what his men had achieved. I said something like, 'That was the most impressive intelligence operation I've ever witnessed.' And he looked at me with this expression, not pride, not false modesty, just patience, like he was explaining something very simple to someone who should have understood it already. And he said, 'That's what we do.' 3 words. Dunlap paused. And I realized in that moment that for him, this wasn't exceptional. This wasn't the highlight of his career. This was Tuesday. This was the standard. And the gap between what they consider standard and what we consider exceptional, that gap is the thing I've never been able to adequately explain to anyone who hasn't seen it." He paused again. The journalist waited. Then Dunlap said the sentence that would become the title of the chapter on Allied Special Operations in the book being written, a phrase later cited in 3 separate defense studies, and one he carried with him from Afghanistan to a quiet home in Virginia, where he kept on his desk a single photograph of 8 men he never named, in front of a mountain he never identified, in a country he never managed to forget. The SAS did not rewrite the manual of modern special operations by accident. It rewrote it because, since David Sterling in the deserts of North Africa, it built a belief that no budget can buy and no technology can replace, that there exists a category of war where the only sensor that works is a pair of human eyes connected to a brain trained to observe, analyze, and endure, at levels most human beings simply do not believe are possible until they see it with their own eyes.